let me tell you something about Roger. He's a friend of ours who's been here quite often before. You were here a year ago, I think, launching your last book as well. He's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, Senior Research Fellow at the Ian Ramsay Centre in Oxford, which is not dissimilar to the Faraday Institute, I guess, although slightly different emphases. And also still a member of the faculties of Philosophy and Theology and Religion at Oxford. He was founding president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and has also, for 3 years, I guess, was president of the European Society for the Philosophy of Religion. So he's had a long career in looking at particularly science and religion and areas around that. His most recent book that I just mentioned is Beyond Matter, Why Science Needs Metaphysics, which is a provocative title. So today he's going to talk about science and Christianity, conflict or cooperation. And a lot of people fall into one or the other camp, and we often hear about conflict, don't we? So I think Roger's going to enlighten us as to whether that really is happening or not. So let's welcome Roger.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be back here in Cambridge. The whole subject, I think, is of importance because it's one that we find actually has a resonance in the ordinary society around us. In other words, this isn't just an academic subject. It is, but it's also one that affects the way we live. When I was at the advisory board for the Faraday Institute a few weeks ago, we were given statistics about the number of young people, and I think they weren't just worldly wise sixth formers, they were much younger children who actually think, when asked, that science has disproved religion. That's almost part of the air they breathe. Science has pushed out religion. And I don't think we can underestimate the effect of that through our society. The idea is, and I'll come back to this, that of course religion is not the kind of thing that can claim truth. I noticed today that I was reading a report on the fact that in Bristol Magistrates Court today 2 street preachers were found guilty of preaching the gospel in the Bristol shopping centre in the middle of Bristol. That wasn't because they, I think, were creating disturbance. That wasn't the issue. It wasn't that there was a riot or anything like that. It was that they were daring to say that Christianity was true, and this was highly offensive. Worse, they were quoting from the King James Bible, and it was said in court, you can't do that without risking causing offence, and if you cause offence, that's a hate crime. And so we suddenly find, and I think this is a very serious attack on free speech, we suddenly find that things that will perhaps used to be taken for granted can't even be said nowadays. And I think that partly comes from the idea that science has monopolized reason, and that Christianity in particular, and religion in general, has nothing to do with reason. I notice you've all had leaflets put on the seats of an article I wrote a long time ago. It was over 10 years ago. I was just glancing at it. I was rather relieved to see that I still believe what's there. And indeed, you may find that some of the things I say tonight actually resonate with what I wrote then, and with what I wrote in the book Beyond Metaphysics. There were only a few copies over there. I think they've all sold out already, so I was gratified about that. Now, I want to ask 4 questions tonight. And they are, does science disprove God? Are science and religion just different? Could science support Christianity? Or does science need Christianity? You might gather from that, if you're quick thinkers, that the first question, does science disprove God, is one I'm going to answer no, otherwise there's no point in my going on with the rest of the lecture. Anyway, does science disprove God? Another way of putting it is, can science explain everything? Do we need any other source of explanation? Is God a meaningless hypothesis? Can we, using Occam's razor, medieval theologian, just cut it out as a needless extra? More to the point, can science explain the conditions and fact of its own success? Can it rule out, perhaps as meaningless, religion morality, aesthetics, even reason and philosophy. I mean, sometimes scientists get pretty far-reaching in what they're claiming. Now, I've grown up, in a sense, with all this throughout my philosophical training, because, as I've mentioned before, I was taught by Professor A.J. Eyre in Oxford, in New College, and he was the archetypal atheist of his day, even to the extent of appearing on chat shows proclaiming it. But he had a very tough-minded empiricism, which stemmed from the Vienna Circle, which was a group of philosophers meeting in Vienna just before the Second World War. When I was in Vienna once, I was standing on the steps of the university and was shown the step on which one of the members, one of the most prominent members of the Vienna Circle, whose name was Schlick, was actually murdered by a graduate student. I don't know if that was anything to do with his philosophical views, but it did bring home to me the fact that perhaps philosophy wasn't as safe as I thought it was. Anyway, the Vienna Circle said very firmly, the scientific world conception, which is what they stood for, knows no unsolvable riddle. In other words, science, yes, can explain everything. That sounds very, very dramatic, but of course, if you look at it, actually it's an easier thing to say than you think, because you just rule out as anything that science can't deal with, not as insoluble, but as meaningless. And so it isn't a real problem. It's a pseudo-problem, even if we can understand it. So there isn't any problem that science can't deal with, because if it can't deal with it, it isn't a problem. I mean, it's obviously a circular argument. And you can find that with a lot of scientists, that they almost beg every question going. Peter Atkins, the Oxford chemist, says, scientific method is the only method of discovering reality. It has not yet encountered a barrier, except, he adds, the one asserted to exist by those fearful of its illumination. Well, of course, if you say, what about this barrier? Ah, you're just fearful. And so he's got an answer already. He doesn't have to bother with about what you say. So empiricists like A.J. Eyre just ruled out anything that wasn't scientific. And that actually created problems, because then you've got the question, what do we mean by science, and what do we mean by saying it's scientific? And of course, it's, I think, generally accepted nowadays that the word science has changed its meaning, particularly, I suppose, since the professionalisation of science from about, say, the 1860s on. And if you look at the German Wissenschaft, that has very wider connotations still. But in English, science has narrowed to mean the scientific method. Here in Cambridge, of course, it was quite recent that philosophy went under the badge of the moral sciences. So it's a word that even within living memory had a wider reach. But the question I think we have to ask is just what can science rule out, and what does it actually presuppose? Is it presupposing things that have to be argued apart from science? As I said, empiricists just ruled it out. When I was going to Ayer's seminars, this is going to date me, it was before men had been to the moon or even been sent satellites around the moon and so on. And the verification principle was thought to be the standard of meaning. In other words, if you can't verify something scientifically, it isn't true or false. It's meaningless. So that's a wonderful way of dealing with God, because you can't verify God. You can't check his existence in a scientific laboratory. And this all goes through observations and experiments. Now, of course, the other side of the moon hadn't been observed at that point. Now, did that mean that it didn't exist? Or are we going to talk about possible observations, things you can in principle verify? This brings on to another question, I think, about what we mean by science, because you could say, hey, wait a minute, science isn't just science as it is, because if we just say everything's explicable in terms of present-day science, why go on doing science? Science progresses. Present-day science is provisional, and I think one ought to remember that. Science does not have the whole truth according to its own lights. So science is progressing, it's building, it's going into a future it can't altogether envisage. So when we talk about verification, do we mean present-day science or some future science, some ideal science? And the more ideal it becomes, the more metaphysical it becomes, because perhaps it's science as it could in principle one be, even though it never will be. So what on earth do we mean by that? Well, as I said, scientists are very prone even to ruling out philosophy. And in my book on Beyond Matter, I've rather attacked this way of trying to rule out a metaphysical base for science. Let me just remind you of what Stephen Hawking says in The Grand Design: philosophy is dead. Scientists have been the bearer of the torch of discovery. Yet, in a few pages later in the same book, he's advocating something called scientific determinism, a philosophical view of ever a third one, and he asks, and this is really a quintessential philosophical question, do we really have reason to believe that an objective reality exists? So, once he said philosophy is dead, what he means is, whatever I do, even if it's philosophy, I'm entitled to do it. I'm as good as any philosopher. And it's a kind of scientific imperialism, I think. Scientists just want to do everything. Now, as I argued in Beyond Matter, I think that you've got to stand outside science to talk about its limits. It is, I think, a theory about the scope of science to say that science can explain everything or that it can't. I mean, you've got to be outside science to talk about what it can do. And the word that often is used to talk about science in this way is naturalism. That's the idea that science is the only source of reality, of our knowledge of reality, is called naturalism. And it's very similar to materialism, physicalism. They have slightly different nuances, but all attempt to rule out metaphysics, and all probably motivated by a desperate desire to rule out talk of God as well, by using the prestige of science. Let me quote for a moment from a man called Jerry Cohn, who wrote a book which was just a year or so back called Faith versus Fact: Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. He said, science has learned through experience that assuming the existence of gods and divine intervention has been of no value in helping us to understand the universe. And our reliance on naturalism is not an assumption decided in advance, but a result of experience. Well, that could never be true, because however much science discovers, to say this is the only thing it can discover, or this is the full explanation of this, or we can never stand outside and think that there are other forces at work, is itself, even true, a statement, as I said, that's primarily philosophical. And I think that there is, as I've said before, of circularity about this. But Cohn wants to talk about the conflict between religion and science. He takes it for granted that they're at odds. And he widens it and really makes it clear what he's saying when he says, I see this as only one battle in a wider war, a war between rationality and superstition. So he's really saying that religion is something that has to be absolutely swept on one side. I think it's fashionable nowadays amongst some people to say, well, the notion of religion is socially constructed, the notion of science is. They're fairly modern concepts. Of course, the word science does, I think, refer to things that we couldn't have referred to in that way centuries ago, partly because of the onward march of technology and our abilities to do things that we couldn't do then. And the whole area of what was once called natural philosophy has narrowed into what's accessible by scientific method. But religion, again, although it's a much contested term, is something that I think has wider implications. I think that a lot of our arguments here about science and religion, atheism and theism, do go back centuries, and indeed even to Roman times and before that. When people talk about the term religion, I'm reminded of Lucretius in his book, which he wrote De Rare Natura, which was a whole collection of really poetry upholding Epicurean philosophy. And it was explicitly upholding an atomist view of the world, a kind of pre-scientific view of the world, but clearly going in an atomist to materialist direction. And he wanted to rule out belief in gods. And he was passionate about that. He said in one point in a very famous tag, tantum religio potuit suadari malorum. Now, let me hasten to translate that, because I'm just betraying the remnants of my classical education there. And what he's really saying is, so many evils were religion able to persuade men to do. And he listed horrors that religion prompted people to do, human sacrifice and so on. And there you have almost a quintessential new atheist attack on religion. And the religion, the belief in the supernatural, was something then that you can even see appearing nowadays as something very similar. But Cohn wants to talk about the war between rationality and superstition in much the same way, I think, as many people through the centuries have. Religion is to science as superstition is to reason, he says. And he says that by relying on faith rather than evidence, religion renders itself incapable of finding truth. Now, I think there's a very false opposition there between faith and reason. But it's one that we come up against time and time again. How often, even in journalism nowadays, do we find the word faith? And the implication is, well, it's something subjective, you should respect it, you get these funny people. But it's not something that should be brought out into public life. We shouldn't talk about it, we can't rationally, in fact, discuss it. Brian Leiter, an American legal philosopher, wrote recently, and he wanted to restrict religious freedom in law. He wrote from the standpoint of law that religion should be sidelined in public life, and he drew a similar distinction between faith and reason, and he drew on this prestige of science that he saw. He wanted to ignore a religious conscience, really, because he claims that the distinctively religious state of mind is that of faith, that is, believing something notwithstanding the evidence and reasons that fail to support it or contradict it. In other words, faith has got nothing to do with reason. So he further says religious belief is insulated from the standards of evidence and reasons that have been vindicated a posteriori since the scientific revolution. So again, you've got the idea, which I think perhaps some religious people sometimes encourage, that faith is something personal and precious, but it's not something that can withstand argument in the marketplace, let alone the scientific laboratory. And this, therefore, paves the way to the second question that I want to ask. Are science and religion just different? Have you got just faith and reason? They're each doing different things. Now, many in the past have tried to avoid conflict between science and religion, sometimes by keeping them totally separate, as Stephen Gould, I noticed I'd mentioned him in the thing that the article on receipts, that science tries to document the factual character of the world, religion operates in the equally important but utterly different realm of human purpose, meanings and values. And in this he was reflecting Alfred North Whitehead, who nearly a century ago now was saying, science is concerned with the general conditions which are observed to regulate physical phenomena. Religion is wholly wrapped up in the contemplation of moral and aesthetic values. And this rather plays into a distinction that's deep in philosophy between fact and value. And if you're not careful, fact is the province of science, value is something different, but fact is objective and can claim truth, values are subjective and are about me. And once you accept that dichotomy, you can't really talk about anything that isn't scientific, and you certainly even can't have an argument about the truth of a moral position. And that, I think, is partly, again, the prestige of science, pushing aside anything that's non-scientific as being unworthy of claiming truth. I remember in the 1950s, a man who, the first person I heard talking about science and religion, when I got to know him personally, was Professor Charles Coulson, who was a professor in Oxford, and I knew him before that. And following Niels Bohr, in one book he wrote, he suggested that science and religion are complementary. I say following Niels Bohr because it was the same kind of business about the complementarity of looking at the position momentum of an electron, and you can't look at both simultaneously. But Coulson was trying to say, and he wasn't downcrying or downplaying the whole notion of truth in religion, but he wanted to say, nevertheless, religion and science are specifically asking different questions, typically how and why. I mean, there's a truth there, of course, but it's, I think, a bit of a dangerous path because, as again, you can get forced into the position of saying, yes, and the one set of questions aren't about truth, and the other are. Similarly, philosophers have been fond of invoking Wittgenstein and his view of different language games played by different rules, so that facts stating statements are one thing and religion can't be judged by them, they're played by different rules. This can merge into postmodernism, which can say, well, of course, different truths hold for different sets of people and different practices. And that's downplaying the whole idea of truth. I mean, one thing I want to emphasise, and always have wanted to, is that there is one thing that's true. I mean, not a particular thing, but truth isn't something that can be divided, so that there's my truth, your truth, their truth, our truth, the truth of religion, but not the truth of science. If the truth is the truth, we all have to, in fact, think that somehow it all will hold together in some way. It's no good just dismissing it and somehow, or even lapsing into this terrible talk about post-truth, whatever that means. So, I think that we have to think that religion should not be necessarily protected in this way from scientific criticism. I mean, that is part of the role of some of these views, to say, oh, well, science has its rules, we have ours, you can't play our game by your rules. So you can't score goals in cricket, that's the kind of idea. So you can't say God exists, because, or God doesn't exist, whatever you want to say, according to the whole game of science, because it isn't part of that particular game. Yet if we live in one world, if this is truly God's world, religion and science may say different things, but they're both making claims about the nature of reality and the place of humans in it. So that shouldn't only affect the way we do science, but it also affects a lot of other things as well. We can't rule out a priori the fact that at different times, different views, religion and science, may even appear to clash. Scientific theories are provisional, hypotheses are put forward. Just because a scientist says something doesn't make it true. It may appear from a religious point of view that it may not be, and perhaps there might be good grounds for thinking that it wasn't. So I think that one has to accept, though, that there are times when these can clash. Religion and science aren't so different that they can't sometimes be talking about the same things. And indeed, if you look at the whole area nowadays, there are sensitive areas, particularly about origins, I think. The origin of the universe, the origin of life, origin of human beings, the origin of consciousness. Science can tell us all about how these things happened, but if naturalists, reductionists, determinists, whatever they call themselves, want to say that science gives us the only truth, that again is just ruling out all religious contributions by philosophical fiat. And as I said before, that tends to be circular anyway. To take an example, naturalist accounts of the human mind are popular even in philosophy, reducing cognitive activity, say, to neural activity. But that isn't the product of a scientific discovery, that's an interpretation of its significance and a philosophical interpretation. And once again, outside science and in philosophy when you're arguing about that. And we must too not forget that science is itself the product of a human mind, human consciousness. Science is always human science in the sense that it's humans doing it. And human reason can grasp truth. If we couldn't make scientific claims. Now, if that's going to be transformed into some causal account of neural pathways, or I think, and I could argue at great length about this, all reference to reason and truth has to be removed. We're just talking about what we do because we're caused to it. It may accidentally be true, but reasoning about it and grasping the truth and seeing something that is true, all that disappears. And I would suggest then that we've sawn off the branch we're sitting at, or on, because we have no reason to believe that the scientific theories that we're relying on actually grasp truth. This human ability to be able to reason and recognise truth lies at the root of all scientific endeavour. And so it can't be reduced to something else. If it is, science itself must disappear as a body of knowledge, because there can be no such thing as claiming knowledge. So science and religion both have to be seen as equally parts of the human cognitive endeavour to understand the nature of the world we live in. And sometimes they're complementary, but sometimes they may try to overreach themselves and to come into contact with each other. But faith and reason, above all, I think can't be separated. Faith is always faith in something. You've got to specify it rationally and say what it is we believe in. Now, faith may need more than the resources of human reason, revelation, for instance, but it must always be faith in something. And therefore faith needs reason to say what that something is. Incidentally, although this isn't something I pursue now, of course the practice of science itself needs a commitment sometimes that itself needs a kind of faith that goes beyond the evidence that's available at the moment. Should I stick with this theory or not? Perhaps a scientist does, because he has faith that one day it will deliver the goods. So anyway, I don't think science and religion are just different. I think they are going to come into contact. So that brings us on to the third question. Can science actually support Christianity? Even to ask that question, I think in the present climate might seem odd. But, and also, just because science is provisional, as I've also mentioned, it's very dangerous to rely on the current state of science in an attempt to justify religious belief. Gaps in our knowledge can be closed. And we have for many years been warned of the dangers of a God of the gaps. This is something that Charles Gruson, who I mentioned, talked about a lot. Indeed, he said in the 1950s that either God is in the whole of nature with no gaps, or he isn't there at all. And if you really take on board the fact that this is God's world, then obviously God is involved in everything, not just in tweaking little bits that science hasn't yet been able to reach. So let me just give two examples in science which are particularly sensitive at the moment in the debate between science and religion, and where some people would say that actually science seems to support religion. Needless to say, in both areas there will be people who will say, oh no it doesn't, and will argue the opposite, and that's the nature of the beast. Let me first of all talk about the cognitive science of religion, which was something I was involved in a big research project in Oxford. Now, the cognitive science of religion has been used on both sides. What it's doing is trying to look at the place of religion in human nature and then the place of religion in the cognitive mechanisms of the human mind. And of course, if you can explain that place, perhaps through evolution, you might seem to have explained religion away, or it's just a mere byproduct of something else. And certainly the cognitive science shows how we can develop particular beliefs, not in a religion, but in the kind of attitudes to the world that give rise to religion. Purpose in the world, for instance. There's a lot of research showing how naturally children see purpose. Even sophisticated scientists, given very quickly judgments about particular things, can lapse into seeing purpose in a way that's quite non-scientific. It is our default mechanism in seeing purpose. Children will always see things in terms of purpose. Why is that rock pointed? You might ask a little child. Now, the child won't say anything about erosion or sedimentation or anything like that. Obviously, the child hasn't got that knowledge. But the child will come up with an explanation very often. A favourite one in research has shown is things like, oh, well, it's pointed so that the birds can't sit on it. Now, an interesting thing is that children not only are eager to ask why, but are ready to produce explanations why. And science perhaps has to go beyond that. But that isn't where we start off. We believe in non-material agency, things that go bump in the night. Who did that? It's a natural tendency to think like that. We believe, quite naturally, when I say we, I mean anthropology shows this. People can believe in mind apart from body. People find it very easy to think of their relatives going on living after death, perhaps even seeing what they're doing, etc. Now, these characteristics seem natural in children and universal in human beings, and some would say they're infantile beliefs, and we have to grow out of them because they're merely byproducts, as I've said, of evolutionary tendencies. But religion could be explained in that way. It's all built on these kinds of tendencies. But otherwise, you might say, well, the fact that they are ubiquitous is perhaps itself of some significance. I mean, for instance, it's been argued that religion is much more natural than science. Now, in a way, that's common sense, I would have thought, really. Let me quote what Canon C. Raven said. Again, this is many years ago. I remember hearing him when I was a schoolboy, preaching Bristol Cathedral at my school's Charter Day. He was a professor in Cambridge here. It was a fine sermon. I can remember what he said, which is an achievement when you're preaching to schoolboys and they remember it umpteen years later. But anyway, he said, the child is interested in metaphysics, even more than in physics, in final causes rather than temporal antecedents, in religion rather than science. Now, he wrote that 2-3 generations ago. But the cognitive science of religion, a very, very modern empirical study, which is ongoing now, I mean, it's really the last 5 years, does agree with that and says precisely that is what the child is interested in. That's where the child starts off from. Children find it very easy to think in terms of even omniscience. They think their mother knows everything, and they go on to thinking that God knows everything. They find it very easy to think like that. I used to think omniscience was an achievement, in a sense, a philosophical notion. But it's surprising that even 4-year-old children can easily say, oh yes, God knows everything. God. So this is where we start off as children. We're prepared for religious belief. Now, it doesn't determine which religion we adopt. It's all underdetermined religion. But nevertheless, perhaps it says something about the fact that we are necessarily, naturally inclined that way. My colleague from Oxford, who's now gone to California, wrote a book called Born Believers, and he says, belief in God begins in childhood and typically continues in adulthood. And it places it in the same class as believing in gravity, the permanence of solid objects, the continuity of time, the predictability of natural laws, the fact that causes precede effects, that animals bear young similar to themselves. I mean, things that children take for granted. They just learn this about the world. I mean, they're not born learning it, but they pick it up very quickly. And Barrett says, if belief in gods or God is being childish or immature in the same respect as these sorts of beliefs, the belief in gods is in good company. We should treat these childish beliefs as innocent until proven guilty. In other words, not just dismiss them as infantile, but they're our very starting point as human beings. This is where we start. And that's a very different approach from those who want to rule out religion a priori on philosophical grounds or on the grounds that it isn't science. And certainly the cognitive science of religion suggests that beliefs are too deeply rooted in us when they're religious to be discarded merely by definition. Robert Macaulay on this kind of subject said in his book Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, and the title sums it all up, he talks of the novelty of scientific tools, of scientific discoveries, of the radically counterintuitive representations the theories of science employ. Religion is different, since the ideas of popular religion are not counterintuitive. And then he points out, what is quite true, of course, that science is a very difficult achievement. It's difficult to learn. You require long years of education. It doesn't come naturally. And indeed, in a way, just because we find it so easy to think in terms of purpose, a scientific attitude is something that takes a long time to latch onto. It's, in fact, he would compare it, I think, much more with rather abstruse theology. Theology is reflection on our natural impulses to be religious. Science is in the same kind of intellectual level. It isn't down there with religion. So it's a much more reflective, rational discipline, whereas we're starting off by being religious. Well, what does this show? Certainly it doesn't prove religion. It certainly doesn't prove Christianity, because of course the whole point about Christianity is it's a revealed religion. But it might suggest that we have hearts prepared to receive revelation. There is a very deep question in theology, I always think. Why does God make it so difficult to believe? And perhaps the answer is, well, he doesn't make it that difficult because we're born with a tendency to believe in something. But we need more. So the cognitive science of religion perhaps, therefore, tells us of the importance and ubiquity of religion without solving every problem, but it does perhaps suggest we ought to take religion more seriously rather than rule it out by definition, as some of the people I quoted at the beginning just wanted to do. A second area that some think is relevant to religion comes from the fundamental properties of the universe, which appear to be fine-tuned for life. This is the so-called anthropic principle. I remember going to a conference in Canada on philosophy of science. It was 1975, and John Wheeler, a very famous physicist, pupil of Einstein, was there, and he was talking about the anthropic principle, and it was brand new. It was just something a year or so old, and it engendered quite a lot of excitement. I remember talking to him at great length on several breakfasts about it, and his line was, let me just sum it up, why is the universe so large? Because we're here. Now, what he was really saying is that the conditions necessary for life, creation of carbon through explosion of stars and so on and so forth, all of that was only possible through the expansion of a universe which had been fine-tuned from the very beginning. If the universe had been very slightly different, and subsequent research has illustrated this more and more, you would find that the initial conditions, if they were tweaked very slightly, would have created a universe that was not one where people could live in. Now, again, of course, that's tremendously significant, perhaps, but plenty of people who wanted to say, oh, no, we're not going to accept that. It's not surprising we're in the universe we're in. I mean, obviously, by definition, we are. But we're in that universe because there's an infinite number of universes. Every possibility is actualized. And all mathematical possibilities are actualized, some mathematicians tell us. And therefore, it's not surprising at all. Now, I think if the answer to a question is an infinite number of universes, I think I prefer the belief in God, because that seems to me multiplying entities beyond all reason. Well, that's something perhaps we can talk about in questions, but the whole idea of the multiverse, which is certainly unverifiable, I mean, it makes me sympathise with Ayer and his logical positivism, certainly of a universe that we could never be in touch with or verify, which would have different scientific laws, it seems as unintelligible and meaningless as any talk about God. And it does illustrate, actually, how philosophical and metaphysical some modern physics has got. And so what, in a way, you have are different, I think, brands of metaphysics facing each other nowadays, but some wearing the white coat of a scientist and claiming the prestige of science. But it's still metaphysical. So I think that that is, again, a view that's indicative, but it doesn't prove anything. And I mean, I don't think in the end any scientific theory could do more than perhaps indicate, well, perhaps that's paving the way to a belief in God. So this brings me on to my final question, does science need Christianity? And early modern scientists such as Newton rooted their natural philosophy in a book of nature, as opposed to, of course, the Bible. But they saw the author of both books as God. And Newton declared that this most elegant system of the sun, planets and comets could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. He saw talk of God as part of natural philosophy. Of course, natural philosophy is wider than what we mean by science, but certainly included that. and indeed natural theology has long been seen as a crucial adjunct and precursor to science. But this brings me to the question of what has science to presuppose to be confident of its own success? Because I think science is too often taken at face value. It's judged by its technological success, its ability to produce the goods, and science works, we're told. But it doesn't actually tell us why we should trust science in the first place. It's just, oh well, it can do all this. You can trust science because you can go up in an aircraft, etc. That's all you need to worry about. It's a pragmatist view of science. In St. John's Gospel, the divine Logos was identified with God and with Christ. In the beginning was the Logos, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Now, I always thought that that was very, very crucial from a philosophical point of view, because there were two words in the first sentence which were resonating from Greek philosophy. The word beginning, arche, which actually has very much the idea of the basic principle behind everything, the principle that governs everything, and the term logos, which was a philosophical principle that was of enormous importance from Greek philosophy, certainly in Stoic philosophy, but also in pre-Socratic philosophy and in Plato. In Heraclitus, for instance, a pre-Socratic philosopher, he saw it as a fairly concrete thing, perhaps even identifying it with fire. I mean, they hadn't got to the realm of pure abstraction at that point. But he used the logos as a principle to show the underlying unity of things that keeps everything in a balanced proportion, stops opposites fighting each other, the wet and the dry were in balance. And so the logos was the principle almost of harmony and proportion, of order underlying everything. And this goes all the way through Greek philosophy. And then in St. John's Gospel, therefore, you have this principle of reason, and I think in a way logos is better almost translated as reason than word, which is after all the root of the word logic. It became identified with the mind of the Creator, and our own reason was seen as a pale reflection of it. As in the Cambridge Platonist adage, reason is the candle of the Lord. So there is a truth linked to the purposes of the Creator and built into the nature of things, and our own reason is able to grasp some of it. So science, I think, has to assume that there is that logos, that assurance of order, of regularity in the world. Physics assumes its laws, whether you understand them as ironclad or, I think better, as generalizations of regularities, they apply through the universe, whether it's observed or unobserved. As Hume well understood in the 18th century when facing the problem of induction, you can't validate that through mere empirical discovery. He just gave up because he didn't want to invoke God. But I think the obvious answer is that you need God to underpin the confidence of science. And science also, as well as underpinning the idea of order in the world, as well as grasping the idea of order in the world, it has to assume the human mind is equipped to uncover the secrets of the universe, in particular that maths, which would seem perhaps to be just a product of human minds, can correspond not just to abstract entities, but to the way things behave in the physical world. So you've got the idea, therefore, that not only is there an order, but that we have the kind of minds that can uncover that order, and maths is one of the ways we can do it. It's pretty extraordinary, really, why that should be the case. People take it for granted. I mean, I can never understand myself why a lot of squiggles on the board that I can't understand somehow can tell you about how the world works. But it's how the human mind is somehow reflecting the underlying rationality of the world. And perhaps that's because we ourselves are made in the image of God and reflect in a very imperfect way the rationality of the Creator. And science also brings with it assumptions about the contingency of the universe. That's a very, very big subject, but things don't have to be as they are. I think the Greeks tended to assume they did, so they could work out how things had to be and they could more or less sit in their armchair and do science. Modern science realizes you can't do that. You have to go and work out how things are by looking and observing, because they could be otherwise. You can't think that things are necessary. I sometimes think that ideas of the theories of everything in science assume a necessity behind things that is an ironclad necessity that perhaps isn't right. Perhaps the world is contingent. God didn't create it in this way rather than that because he had to. He could have created it differently. So the world is contingent, and we have to look at it to see, in fact, how it has been created. Yet, human reason needs freedom. I mentioned this before. We need our reason to grasp truth. To hold our reason, we need the freedom to be able to look at alternatives. We therefore need to assume we have free will. And so the Christian idea of free will is actually crucial in science, I think. And perhaps it itself reflects the freedom inherent in the rationality of the Creator. Modern science certainly transcends the mechanistic world of Newton, but scientific laws may point to deep regularities. But since nothing is necessary, human beings don't have to be regarded as being bound by some chain of determinism. So Christian doctrines about human nature themselves underpin the very possibility of doing science. We have to be free to use our reason, to understand what is true. Yet the world has to be such as to be susceptible to such investigation, so that it is safe to generalise from now to then, from here to there. The world has to have order built into it, yet not be a world that is necessarily like that. So science is vital to help us understand the nature of that world, but we need a science that's humble enough to realise that it brings to its investigations assumptions that have their whole basis and source beyond science. Those assumptions don't go against reason, but they ground reason. And one of my objections to the people who take science at face value and say that science explains everything is that they take reason for granted without thinking what can ground it. In some ways, I think I have a lot of sympathy with Nietzsche, who really attacked the whole idea of reason, and indeed if you take God out of things, I think the whole notion of reason does fall apart, and so does the whole of science, therefore. Without a belief in an underlying logos, identified with God, and reflected in our own slight abilities in some way, I would say that the purpose and function of all science is put very much in question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. That leaves plenty of time for questions. So, who would like to start? There is a microphone, so please wait for that to arrive if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question of Roger.
Roger, I enjoyed your point about the cognitive science of religion, which is interesting as a critique of a sort of dominant sociological or anthropological or cultural account of religion as emerging in purely historical context, absolutely contingent, etc. Although, of course, the majority of those cognitive scientists are skeptics or atheists, as you point out. It can move the other way, and you could take cognitive science as evidence for something preparing the ground for faith. What would you make, however, of a criticism that said, well, okay, but a deeper account of that religious instinct, and certainly any account that's going to make sense of Christianity, has to take into consideration what William James called the phenomenon of the twice born, i.e., it's not, as it were, those childlike instincts that are really key, the projection of some father figure. It's rather the religious sensibility that emerges out of what James very eloquently calls the iron of melancholy. So that's really my question. I mean, to what extent is that cognitive science move, how helpful is it for the kind of apologetics that you are wishing to project?
Well, I think actually cognitive science of religion is pretty neutral. I mean, I would say it doesn't explain away religion, but it does show, one thing it does show, and I think everybody accepts that religion is there, it's part of human nature. And that means that there was a sociological view, of course, about secularism in the 1960s, and relevant to science, that science was going to, in fact, drive religion away, that science was a force of enlightenment and progress which would drive superstition, and that meant religion completely away, and it would wither. And, of course, I think that if you look around the world at the moment, that is not the case, but one would not expect it to be the case, because the cognitive science of religion shows that it's so deeply rooted into human nature, it's always going to be there as a powerful factor. And I think that that's important. Now, it doesn't say very much about what kind of religion you have. It certainly doesn't say anything about Christianity as such, and it doesn't say very much about how we should grow out of these infantile views, although I suppose it's relevant that Christ said, except as you become one of these little ones, etc. I mean, a childlike faith is not wholly a bad thing, but there is a simplicity about it. But certainly one has to grow out of that and have a more adult ownership of something. And I think that that's obviously true. And obviously, I mean, cognitive science of religion doesn't come anywhere near Christianity. All it does is say, in a sense, that you're prepared. There's a God-shaped hole in the mind, so to speak. And so if somebody comes along and talks about God, you would understand in a way what they're talking about. I mean, otherwise, I mean, you've got to think, if everything is cultural, how does religion ever get started? Because people aren't going to understand what people are talking about, they're not going to grasp it, they're not going to be interested in it. So the very fact that religion is so ubiquitous and different religions find it so easy to latch on to people shows that there is a tendency there to want to actually grasp something like this. But it doesn't show which religion is true, it doesn't show if any does, and of course it's open to somebody to say, well, that's why people are religious, because there are these byproducts of evolution, etc. within us. But obviously, I mean, the infantile side of it is double-edged, because certainly there's a simplicity about that, but from a religious point of view, you obviously have to grow out of that. I mean, even St. Paul said, when I was a child, etc. So you have to grow out of that and mature in a very definite way. Does that get anywhere near answering it? Because I mean, one of the big things, though, you mentioned at the beginning, which I think is important, is that the cognitive science of religion does one thing that I think is enormously important, and that show that a lot of what we say about human nature is not to do with society, to do with culture, it's to do with what humans are. And there's been far too much in my lifetime talking about social construction and culture and the difference of cultures, and you very easily slip then into a kind of relativism of difference of cultures. And you don't assume then the commonality between all human beings, which I think is terribly important and can explain a lot of human behaviour. And as we understand more about the genetic basis of human behaviour, I hope that we might get away from that and understand however important the social and cultural side of things are, nevertheless they're a superstructure. I mean, different cultures enjoy different foods, but we only, in fact, have food because we need to eat, and then therefore we're back at something more fundamental.
Any more comments or questions? Yeah.
Good evening. I would like to suggest a certain thing, because it's always about religion versus science, science versus religion,
Yeah.
and I think it's kind of not really. It's kind of set to fail from the start. What about cooperation? I mean, if you imagine in ancient depiction of Christ, there was a Christ in the middle of a zodiac, right? What I want to say is, it was a depiction of ideal man, and around him were certain talents, or his abilities, certain specific things what a man can do. I mean, so on one hand, man can be a highly rational man, or he can be a highly religious man, or emotional, or he can be a good sportsman, or whatever. I think what I'm really asking is, if on one hand you got real rational scientists, on the other hand you got believers who only emotionally engage in some kind of intuition, which might be true or might be not, but I think there are very few people who can actually evolve into an ideal man, if you know what I mean. to be able to grasp all kinds of view about reality, and then to see things how they really are. What I'm really asking is if those rational scientists are not in some kind of way handicapped, blind to certain things, and believers, on the other hand, are blind to other things. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. I think that it's very important, actually, not to separate out rationality and science on one hand and emotion and belief on the other. And you're quite right, the two should always be integrated, and the two can fertilize the other. I tried to say tonight that I think that the reason that science depends on itself depends on a religious view of the world. But of course, there is more to religion than just looking at facts or believing propositions, and that how we live depends on our religious views, and our whole way of life should depend on that. I mentioned C. Raven, and in the sermon I referred to, that he quoted, I always remember one phrase that he used, that Jesus is who God means by man and who man means by God. And I think that actually, and he said that more in the context of coming from the point of view of science and religion. I think that actually shows that the life of Jesus itself as a model shows that it isn't just a matter of cold rationality. Action follows. We stand for things as well. But you have to integrate both. So I agree that cooperation is terribly important. And certainly, if you tear the two apart, then I think you have a very depleted view of what life is.
Can I ask a question? Then we'll go to yours at the back. You mentioned the unnatural nature of science.
Yes.
That was actually the title of a book that Lewis Wolpert wrote.
Ah, yes.
A very eminent scientist,
Yes.
The Unnatural Nature
Yes.
of Science. And my question is that there is quite a lot of science which is being done today, particularly in quantum mechanics and those things, which actually can lead to no physical observable facts. So, for instance, string theory, which has been the reason for actually probably hundreds of, in fact thousands of physicists being employed, has never yet made an observable prediction.
Quite.
So, is this science or not? You know, it's right at the core of many physics departments. Sorry, how many physicists here work on string theories?
And it talks about unobservable dimensions and so on. And I get worried about that. I mean, I think they're getting involved in metaphysics. Of course, the science progresses, and the science of the present day might be dealing with something that seems metaphysical. But I mean, there are different kinds of metaphysical statements, I suppose. Some that might one day get within the reach of science to be actually dealt with, and others that are beyond science. I mean, like God. But I suppose sometimes some statements might actually be about what is apparently unobservable, like the other side of the moon, and then other things, and then gradually we go on and on. But I think if you get something that's unobservable in principle, and this is the same with the multiverse, I do get worried. I mean, I do wonder if I've been infected with the verification theory sometimes, because my hackles do rise there. But I think they rise not so much because I mind people talking about such things. I think it's very interesting if mathematicians want to play around with that kind of thing. But that it is real working science rather than something more metaphysical is what I worry about. It doesn't seem to me less metaphysical than a lot of what goes on in the theology department.
Can I just press you then as a follow-up about philosophy? Because it seems to me, actually, philosophy at its best always actually leads to actions. You know, the whole movements have been based on particular philosophies, haven't they? Is philosophy ever in a vacuum?
Yeah, but I don't know about philosophy at its best leads to actions. I would say philosophy at its best sees what's true. But, I mean, the same with science. I mean, it doesn't necessarily lead to something if you see what's true. It might, but I think the fact that something is the case is part of it. I think what we've got to get away from is this idea that all that matters is that science works and that we've got to keep our feet on the ground. William James, who's been mentioned, was up, I've mentioned this before, I mentioned it in my last book, but he was up in upstate New York, and he came back and found his friends were on the campsite were having an argument about a squirrel, and a squirrel was going round the tree, and they were going round the trunk of the tree, and the squirrel was keeping the trunk of the tree between the squirrel and them. I mean, you can try this with squirrels around here if you like. But squirrels do that. They want to get and the argument was, are we going round the squirrel when we're going round the tree as the squirrel was going round the trunk? But they never actually caught up with the squirrel because the squirrel was a bit canny. Now, William James just exploded, and he said this is exactly what a metaphysical question is. It's totally useless, nothing hangs on it, it doesn't alter the world, it doesn't make a difference. That's what metaphysics is. We don't have to bother about metaphysics. Now, I, in fact, would say, well, maybe it may not be a scientific issue, but very often issues of truth do hang on it, and it might be they're nevertheless important. I mean, I don't think whether there's a multiverse is actually very obviously a scientific question, because I think unless you it depends how you define other universes, but if by definition they can never be in contact with our present universe, therefore by definition they're unknowable, well, I would be far from willing to say they don't exist. Who am I to say that? But I am willing to say that's not science. I mean, it doesn't seem to, I mean, whatever it is, it's interesting speculation. You may have mathematics to play with to show it. But unless there's any kind of observable effect on our universe, surely you can't talk about it in any real way. And so I do think here that one's got to differentiate, iterate between what's metaphysics and what's science. But I differ with James in saying that I think what is metaphysics is still important. And indeed it might impinge on what works one day, even if we don't know now. But I don't think we have to know that we've got our feet in the ground to be talking about things like that.
Yeah, right at the back.
Hello, I'm Ray Langton. I'm a philosophy professor at Cambridge. I just wanted to comment on your contrast between science and metaphysics, and wanted to suggest that science is metaphysics. So not just because it's got these more mysterious, unverifiable bits that you were commenting on, both of you, but because metaphysics is simply the theory of what there is. And so if science is saying that there is anything, whether an electron or a building or people or a big bang, whatever, that's a species of metaphysics. And we do metaphysics every day when we are wondering, whether there's any beer in the fridge. That is a piece of metaphysics. It's a question about what exists. So I would like to open up and find a more generous conception of metaphysics where science is contributing to one bit of it, and all of this, economists, if they talk about money, that's talking about something that exists, and it's actually the social construction of money is a very interesting topic, and it's about social ontology. What on earth could it be? And so can we think of a question about the relationship between science and metaphysics, which sees us as engaging in the same project and sees physics as simply part of metaphysics that might or might not rule out other parts. I know we're going to disagree about which parts it rules out, but still there's all kinds of categories of ontology out there, and by the way, social construction gets at one of them, because we need to understand what things like money is, what the things like a person who is the head of a college is. This involves social ontology, and physics is doing a different sort of ontology, and so is philosophy of religion. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting. It goes against, I suppose, traditional views from Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle distinguished, I suppose, between metaphysics and physics. I mean, he wrote different books about them. But I think that what you're saying is that science depends on metaphysics, because insofar as it asserts that things exist, it's using ontology. Its notion of what exists is an ontological view, which itself is a metaphysical statement. So when it says what exists, it's using its methods. But the notion of existence is actually fundamentally a metaphysical view. I mean, I'm an unapologetic realist about things, but that's a classic metaphysical position. Rather, it's about the character of what exists and what it means to say something exists, that there is such a thing as ontology, that ontology is different from epistemology, for instance. But that's all, in a way, talking about in a metaphysical way. You can talk, I quite agree, you can talk in a metaphysical way about the world around us, but nevertheless we're using metaphysical categories to talk about that, and I suppose the notion of existence is still different from the kind of methodology used in a science laboratory to get at what exists. But the notion that it does exist is, of course, a very important basic category.
Any last questions people would like to ask? If not, I have a metaphysical comment now, which the wine is out of the fridge in the back there. So we'll end and have some drinks, and thank you very much for joining us. Let's thank Roger again.